You really think you can tell me what to do on my own property?" The words hit the air like static before dawn as I pulled up to the gravel driveway that led to my small hilltop house just outside Austin, Texas, the faint scent of crushed sage and morning dew clinging to my boots. I've been staring at this patch of land for years, 3 acres of rolling hills where my grandparents once ran cattle and where my childhood memories lingered like ghostly echoes in the wind. My name is Ethan Parker, 38, middle-class electrician, still wiping the sweat from a long night repairing streetlights, tired to the bone, but with a determination that no amount of fatigue could erase. The sun hadn't fully crested the horizon yet, painting the sky in streaks of lavender and gold. But there she was, standing at the edge of the property where the HOA had just planted a series of community enhancement signs, her blazer a striking fuchsia that clashed violently with the muted earth tones of my land, her short blonde curls perfectly styled, as if she had stepped out of a magazine photo shoot, the heels of her shoes clicking against the asphalt in deliberate rhythm as she surveyed my driveway like a general inspecting enemy lines. Margaret Lively, 49, president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA, had that aura of unshakable authority, the kind that made people nod along even when they were furious inside, and she wielded it with the precision of a surgeon and the subtle malice of someone who had mastered manipulation over decades. I felt my jaw tighten as she raised her hand, pointing at the new signs, and said with that syrupy yet commanding tone, "These markers are for the good of the neighborhood, Ethan. You'll see in time that everyone will appreciate it." Her eyes glinted with that mixture of self-satisfaction and condescension that made my stomach churn, the smell of her expensive perfume masking the faint tang of early morning asphalt and gasoline from the work trucks scattered across my front yard. I shifted my weight, feeling the grit of gravel crunch beneath my worn work boots, the lingering taste of strong black coffee on my tongue, and the knot of frustration growing in my chest. Every instinct in me screamed that she had no right to plant those signs on my private property, that her smile and pointed finger were shields for entitlement rather than reason. And yet, as always, she exuded confidence that made it almost impossible to challenge her outright, without feeling like the fool in a play she had rehearsed 1,000 times. The wind carried the faint whir of a distant lawnmower, the chirp of mockingbirds, and the subtle hum of a neighbor's car engine warming up, mundane sounds that only intensified the tension, grounding the surreal confrontation in reality. I could feel my pulse quicken, the heat of frustration mingling with the early morning chill, and a flicker of doubt crossed my mind. What if my attempts to reclaim authority over my own property just escalated her already aggressive strategy? But then I remembered every detail. The original deed, the survey markers my grandfather had laid decades ago, the countless weekends I had spent repairing fences, clearing brush, and measuring plots with care, memories embedded in the very soil beneath our feet. My fingers itched to reach for the paperwork in my truck, to prove ownership and demand respect, but I held myself back, letting the silence stretch between us, awkward and electric, each of us sizing the other up. She tilted her head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips, as if she could sense my hesitation, my internal calculations, and she reveled in it. The click of her heels a rhythmic reminder of the power she wielded so effortlessly. I inhaled deeply, the scent of damp earth and cut grass filling my lungs, letting the emotions settle just enough to force a decision, to set the stage for the slow burn that would inevitably turn this standoff into a calculated game of patience, leverage, and revelation. Every second ticked by like a metronome, each one thick with possibility, fear, and the quiet anticipation of what move I would make next, my mind running through scenarios as naturally as breathing, the early sun glinting off her blazer, highlighting the sharp edges of her carefully maintained aura of dominance, and I knew this was just the beginning of a confrontation that would demand every ounce of composure, creativity, and strategic thinking I could summon, all while the world outside continued in its oblivious routine, neighbors tending to their yards, distant dogs barking, a lone hawk circling overhead, the smell of breakfast wafting from an open kitchen window somewhere down the lane, a living, breathing tableau of ordinary life clashing with the quiet, simmering tension that defined this morning on my land, a place I loved, a place I was determined to defend, and as Margaret adjusted her stance, hands on hips, gaze locked on mine, I realized that every instinct, every memory, every ounce of patience would be tested before the day was done, and the game of negotiation, resistance, and carefully measured escalation had already begun. The crunch of gravel under my boots faded as I stepped closer to the signs, the morning sun warming the back of my neck, the faint aroma of cut grass mixing with the metallic tang from my work truck, and I felt a twinge of uncertainty creep in despite my resolve. I ran a hand over the steering wheel, feeling the worn leather grooves under my fingers, and thought about the hours I had spent maintaining this land, fixing the broken fence posts, mowing the uneven edges along the property line, all for this sense of quiet ownership that now felt threatened. I glanced at Margaret, her fuchsia blazer glowing in the sunlight, and caught the subtle narrowing of her eyes as if she could see through every hesitation I had, every tiny thought flickering across my mind, and I realized she thrived on the tension as much as she did on authority. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint whiff of barbecue smoke from a neighbor down the lane and the distant hum of a lawnmower that sounded oddly intrusive in the otherwise still morning, and I noticed my heart rate climb, a mix of irritation and apprehension, wondering how far she would push before she reached the point of real conflict. I adjusted my stance, shifting weight from one foot to the other, feeling the ache in my knees from the night's work, the tightness in my shoulders from stress, and for a moment I questioned whether I should have called the county surveyor ahead of time or gathered the deeds and permits in my truck before stepping out. That hesitation was fleeting, though, replaced quickly by resolve as I reminded myself of every legal marker, every historical boundary, and every memory embedded in the soil, from picking up stones with my grandfather as a kid to clearing brush after long summer days. And I knew these tangible connections were more than just sentiment. They were leverage, evidence, and a reminder of why I could not back down. Margaret took a step forward, the click of her heels punctuating each syllable as she began. "Ethan, I really think you will see the value in aligning with the neighborhood." Her voice smooth but firm, the kind that made the words seem both polite and unyielding at the same time, and I caught a flicker of smirk in her expression that suggested she was gauging whether I would flinch under the subtle social pressure, a test that carried both challenge and risk. I inhaled slowly, the smell of damp earth grounding me, letting the tension build just enough to think clearly, observing how the sunlight highlighted the faint creases in her blouse, the polished sheen of her shoes, the slight tilt of her chin that conveyed unshakable confidence, and I allowed myself a brief mental note of her habits, her style, the rhythm of her gestures, as if memorizing each subtle cue could give me an advantage in the next move. My mind raced through scenarios of how to respond, whether to challenge her directly, feign agreement to gather more information, or document every micro-movement she made for leverage later. And in that moment, I realized that patience might be as powerful a tool as confrontation. The wind picked up slightly, stirring the tall grass at the edges of my property, brushing against my jeans, reminding me of the hours of solitude spent here when problems felt smaller, simpler, and I felt a pang of longing for those undisturbed mornings, a brief emotional cliffhanger that reminded me why this fight mattered. I glanced around, noticing the neighbor's mailbox leaning slightly off-kilter, the old oak tree shadow stretching long across the lawn, the soft hum of a distant car engine, every ordinary detail becoming part of the tension, and I caught myself hesitating, wondering what her next move would be, the stakes in that subtle smirk, and how I would maneuver without losing control. My fingers itched to grab the deeds, to show her the concrete proof, but I resisted, letting the silence linger just enough to observe her reaction, the tilt of her head, the subtle narrowing of her eyes, the faintest exhale through her nose that betrayed a hint of impatience, and I realized in that suspended moment that the smallest observations might be the key to turning the situation in my favor. I shifted again, feeling the fatigue in my shoulders and legs, the faint cramp in my back from bending over trucks and tools the night before, a reminder that I was human, fallible, yet determined, and as Margaret adjusted her stance, tapping a manicured finger against one hip, I let curiosity build naturally, imagining the internal calculations behind her confident gaze, the strategies she might employ, and the unfolding possibilities of how this morning might end, leaving me poised at the edge. of decision, the anticipation stretching like the early morning shadows across my land, knowing that every step, glance, and pause was now a part of an intricate, cinematic game of patience, observation, and subtle power play that had only just begun. The tension lingered in the air as I walked along the edge of the property line, the gravel crunching beneath my boots with each step, and I could feel the residual heat from the sun warming the earth, the faint scent of freshly cut grass mixing with the subtle tang of metal from my work truck nearby. Margaret had not moved from her stance, the fuchsia of her blazer catching the light in a way that made her silhouette almost luminous against the muted green hills, her short blonde curls shifting slightly in the morning breeze, and her expression remained unreadable, confident, and precise, the kind that made me question every instinct I had about how to respond. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the sweat from my exertion along my back, and tried to steady the quickening pulse in my chest, knowing that any misstep could tip the delicate balance of this confrontation, and yet I was drawn by a mix of curiosity and resolve, wanting to see exactly how far she would push, and what gaps in her strategy one could exploit without revealing my own plans prematurely. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the tall grass along the property edges, carrying with it a faint whiff of morning coffee from a neighbor down the road and the distant hum of a pickup engine, background noise that seemed inconsequential but somehow amplified the intensity of the moment, grounding the surreal tension in a layer of everyday reality. I paused, taking in the layout of my yard, the small oak near the fence line, the uneven gravel path that led to the gate, the subtle shifts in the sun across the hills, and I felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with irritation, recalling long summer days spent maintaining this land, tending fences, and walking these same paths with my grandfather, each memory a thread connecting me to the property and to the quiet determination I felt now. Margaret shifted slightly, heels clicking, and tilted her head, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of her lips, and I sensed that she was measuring my reactions, cataloging my hesitation, and I felt a ripple of both anxiety and amusement, recognizing the subtle dance of power we were engaged in, one that required patience, observation, and careful maneuvering. I adjusted my grip on the clipboard I had picked up from the truck, the edges pressing into my palms, a tangible reminder of the evidence and historical documents that anchored my claim, and I felt a flicker of confidence mingling with fatigue, a reminder that despite the social pressure and her assertive presence, I had tools and knowledge on my side that she could not predict. The light shifted again, glinting off the corner of her heels, highlighting the meticulous styling of her blouse, the carefully tailored lines of her blazer, and I allowed a slow exhale, recognizing the duality of respect and challenge inherent in the situation, acknowledging her competence while preparing for the subtle counter moves that might turn the day in my favor. A faint sound of laughter drifted from a neighbor's backyard, incongruously light and fleeting, drawing a small smirk from me as I considered how the ordinary world continued around our standoff, indifferent to the power dynamics unfolding on this small piece of land. I felt my shoulders tense and relax in alternation, my mind running through scenarios, potential dialogue, and responses, each thought layered with the uncertainty of human emotion, the natural hesitation that comes from caring deeply about what is at stake, and the imperfect reasoning that makes every decision feel weighty and consequential. Margaret finally shifted her stance, crossing one arm over the other hand tapping lightly against her chin as if pondering my next move, and in that subtle gesture, I glimpsed the strategy beneath the confidence, the social cues that suggested her calculation was deliberate and measured, and I knew that patience, timing, and the careful reveal of my own knowledge would be essential. The sun climbed higher, warming the back of my neck, the breeze carrying intermittent sounds of birds and distant traffic, and I felt a blend of anticipation and resolve, each sensory input reinforcing the reality that this confrontation was a living, breathing scenario, not a rehearsal, and that my next steps, measured and deliberate, could shift the power dynamic in ways that would surprise even someone as seasoned and assertive as Margaret, leaving both of us poised on the edge of revelation, strategy, and the intricate choreography of human interaction that defined this morning on my land. The morning stretched on with a gentle warmth, sunlight spilling across the rolling hills, highlighting the subtle curves of my property, each blade of grass catching the light differently. And I could feel the tension coiling in my chest as I considered the subtle moves Margaret was making, the way she shifted her weight, crossed her arms, and surveyed the property with that blend of confidence and scrutiny that made me both wary and intensely curious. I took a slow step forward, the gravel crunching softly beneath my boots, the faint aroma of wet soil from the previous night's dew mixing with the distant smell of frying bacon from a neighbor's breakfast, grounding the surreal intensity of the moment in the everyday world. My fingers brushed against the clipboard in my hand, the edges pressing into my palm, a tangible reminder of the deeds, property maps, and historical surveys that had been collected over decades, each one a silent but powerful ally in the silent negotiation unfolding. I felt a flicker of doubt, questioning whether my careful observations were enough to anticipate Margaret's next move, whether she had considered my knowledge of the property, and the feeling was quickly replaced by resolve, a mixture of respect for her acumen and recognition that I had my own leverage, subtle but firm, waiting to be deployed at the right moment. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the tall grasses along the fence line, carrying with it the faint scent of gasoline from a passing vehicle and the hum of early morning activity elsewhere in the neighborhood, background details that contrasted sharply with the quiet intensity of our standoff, making every movement, every glance, every subtle shift in posture feel like part of an elaborate chess game. Margaret's eyes flicked briefly toward the horizon, and I noticed the slight tightening around her mouth, the small inhale before she adjusted her stance, signals that were imperceptible to most but significant to me, feeding my curiosity and prompting me to consider the timing, the phrasing, the subtle gestures that might turn the balance in my favor without triggering overt confrontation. I allowed a slow exhale, tasting the crisp air, feeling the warmth on my face, and let my mind wander through all the strategies, recalling past experiences on this land, the hours spent repairing fences, clearing brush, and tracing property lines, memories embedded in the soil that now reinforced my sense of authority and connection, and I recognized that those small details, the accumulated hours of care and attention, gave me a unique advantage, if only I could use them with patience and precision. The faint chirp of birds and the distant rev of a lawnmower punctuated the stillness, the ordinary sounds of suburban life contrasting with the charged interaction unfolding at the edge of my property, and I felt the natural tension between public routine and private negotiation, a delicate balance that required attentiveness and strategic thought. Margaret's gaze met mine again, unwavering, her fuchsia blazer catching the sunlight as she shifted slightly, the subtle click of her heels marking the passage of time, a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, a signal that she was fully aware of the psychological stakes, and I could sense both challenge and opportunity in her movements, a combination of intimidation and vulnerability carefully curated for effect. I weighed my next words, considering tone, cadence, and emphasis, aware that anything too direct could escalate, while anything too hesitant might signal weakness. And in that moment, the emotional complexity of the scene, the subtle interplay of power, patience, and curiosity, became tangible, pressing against my awareness with each passing second. I felt a flicker of amusement at the contrast between her polished exterior and the messy, human reality of the property, a reminder that even the most calculated personas are susceptible to oversight, and I let that thought simmer as I adjusted my stance, shifting weight, feeling the fatigue in my shoulders from the previous night's labor, the lingering tension in my jaw, and the subtle knot in my stomach, knowing that each microdecision, each observational insight, and each moment of hesitation or recognition could influence the outcome of the morning, the delicate balance of power and perception, and the cinematic unfolding of a negotiation that was as much about patience, awareness, and strategic positioning as it was about the tangible markers of ownership that lay before us in the soft morning light. The mid-morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the uneven gravel of my driveway, the subtle warmth brushing against my arms, and the faint scent of dew-soaked earth mixing with the distant aroma of coffee from a neighbor's open window, and I could feel the weight of the confrontation pressing on my chest, a mix of anticipation, fatigue, and simmering determination that refused to be ignored. I shifted my weight, feeling the strain in my knees from the previous hours, and noticed Margaret adjusting her stance, heels clicking softly against the ground, a rhythmic reminder of her poised authority, and the slight tilt of her head as she scanned the property line, every gesture precise, deliberate, designed to assert control, and yet her meticulous composure hinted at subtle cracks, fleeting glimpses of tension beneath the polished exterior. I ran a hand along the edge of the clipboard I held, its corners pressing into my palm, grounding me in the tangible, the documented evidence of ownership that I had meticulously compiled, the maps, permits, and historical surveys, each page a quiet testament to the time and care invested in this land. And I felt a surge of quiet confidence tempered by the human uncertainty of timing and delivery, the natural hesitation of wanting to measure every move before committing. The wind stirred through the tall grass, brushing against my jeans, carrying with it the faint hum of a distant lawnmower and the intermittent chirp of birds, and the ordinary suburban noises juxtaposed sharply against the charged tension between us, amplifying every glance, every micro-expression, every subtle inflection in our voices. Margaret spoke then, her words smooth yet commanding. "Ethan, you will understand soon that collaboration benefits everyone here." And the cadence of her voice, measured and confident, carried the implication of judgment, of expectation, and I felt the familiar twist of frustration and determination, knowing that this was less about cooperation than about testing boundaries, probing for hesitation, and subtly shifting the balance of psychological influence. And I allowed myself a slow inhale, tasting the crisp morning air, letting it steady my nerves, while mentally mapping the precise sequence of counteractions I could deploy. I glanced toward the horizon, the sunlight glinting off distant rooftops, and felt a pang of nostalgia for simpler mornings spent alone on this land, tending fences and repairing structures, moments where the stakes were personal, but devoid of the intricate social calculations imposed by the HOA, and that memory sharpened my awareness, reminding me why this fight mattered and why patience and observation were as critical as any legal argument. My mind flickered between scenarios, each one layered with variables, the subtle interplay of timing, observation, and dialogue, while I noticed Margaret subtly shifting her weight, the faint click of her heels aligning almost unconsciously with my own movements, creating a rhythm that was both unnerving and informative, and I realized that each gesture, each pause, each tilt of the head or narrowing of the eyes conveyed intent, strategy, and opportunity. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, feeling the tension ebb slightly, a pause that let the ordinary surroundings, the sway of trees, the hum of traffic, the occasional distant bark, intersect with the heightened awareness of this standoff, a cinematic blend of environment and human imperfection that made each decision feel weighty and immediate. Margaret's eyes met mine again, unwavering, her lips pressed in a thin line, her fuchsia blazer catching a brief glint of sunlight, and I felt the quiet tug of curiosity mixed with calculation, the anticipation of her next move, the recognition that subtlety, timing, and measured responses could turn the day in my favor, and I adjusted my stance once more, feeling the ache in my back from bending over tools the previous night, the lingering tightness in my shoulders, the knot of determination in my stomach, knowing that the unfolding sequence of gestures, words, and observations would define the trajectory of this morning, a dynamic interplay of patience, strategy, and human imperfection that was as tangible as the gravel beneath my boots, the sunlight warming the tips of the grass, and the soft, continuous rhythm of life moving on around us, even as the delicate chess game of authority and leverage played out under the morning sky. As the sun continued its climb, casting brighter light over the uneven gravel driveway, I felt the warmth on my shoulders and the faint sweat prickling at the back of my neck, a subtle reminder of the early morning labor and the mental strain of this standoff. Margaret shifted slightly, heels clicking softly, her fuchsia blazer reflecting the sunlight with a precision that seemed almost deliberate, each movement measured to project authority, and yet I caught a slight narrowing of her eyes, a fleeting hint of impatience or calculation that made me reconsider my assumptions about her unshakable composure. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, gravel crunching under my boots, and inhaled deeply, tasting the faint tang of damp earth mingled with the residual scent of coffee from a neighbor's breakfast, grounding the moment in the reality of suburban life while my mind raced through possible responses, weighing tone, body language, and timing with painstaking care. Every instinct told me to maintain patience, to let the silence between us stretch just enough to observe her next subtle move. And yet the tension in my shoulders, the fatigue in my back from the night before, and the knot in my stomach reminded me that human endurance has limits, and that each micro-decision carried consequences for both perception and control. The wind rustled the tall grasses along the edge of the property, the soft hum of a distant car engine punctuating the otherwise still morning, and I noticed Margaret's fingers tapping lightly against her chin, a subconscious rhythm that hinted at internal deliberation, a subtlety that could be easily missed by an untrained eye but not by mine, and it made me acutely aware of the layered psychological dance we were engaged in. I shifted the clipboard slightly, feeling the corners press into my palms, grounding myself in the tangible evidence of ownership, the documents meticulously collected over years, maps, surveys, and notes that chronicled every change, every repair, every boundary. And in that physical connection to the material, I found a quiet surge of confidence tempered by the human hesitation that comes from navigating complex social interactions. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood, birds chirping, a distant lawnmower, the faint rumble of a passing vehicle, intersected with the extraordinary tension of the moment, highlighting the contrast between the rhythm of daily life and the charged atmosphere of negotiation, observation, and subtle strategy unfolding on my land. Margaret's gaze flicked toward mine, unwavering and precise, and I felt the interplay of curiosity and caution, the anticipation of her next words or gestures, and the recognition that patience, timing, and the careful revelation of information could shift the balance in subtle but meaningful ways. My mind cycled through scenarios, imagining her potential responses, testing my own restraint, balancing emotional authenticity with strategic positioning, each thought layered with hesitation, curiosity, and the natural imperfection of human calculation. The light shifted across the hills, glinting off the subtle contours of the property, the shadow of the fence stretching long and thin, and I sensed the quiet anticipation building, the cinematic rhythm of observation, tension, and potential revelation carrying the moment forward, demanding attention, focus, and the nuanced judgment that comes only from experience, grounding every decision in both the physicality of the land and the psychological complexity of the interaction, while the ordinary world continued in the background, birds, distant engines, and the gentle whisper of the breeze creating a living, breathing tableau that framed the intricate interplay of power, patience, and human imperfection. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, warm shadows across the rolling hills, the gravel driveway glowing softly in the light, and I felt the tension in my shoulders ease just slightly as the subtle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and a hint of diesel from my work truck, grounding the moment in both familiarity and anticipation. Margaret shifted once again, the soft click of her heels echoing across the yard, her fuchsia blazer catching the sun in a way that made the color almost vibrate, and I noticed the minute twitch of her fingers at her side, the barely perceptible narrowing of her eyes, subtle signals that she was calculating, measuring, and probing, unaware that I had been quietly absorbing every gesture, every breath, every tiny shift in weight as part of a larger mental map of her strategy. I let a slow exhale escape, the morning tension giving way to a deliberate focus, my mind sifting through all the historical surveys, property maps, and notes in the clipboard pressed to my chest, weighing each element against the cues she had unknowingly provided, every detail a possible turning point, every hesitation a potential advantage. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the tall grasses along the property line, carrying with it the distant sound of a lawnmower and the faint hum of traffic, the ordinary rhythms of the neighborhood contrasting sharply with the quiet strategic dance unfolding between us. And I felt the duality of ordinary life and high-stakes observation pressing against my awareness, heightening each sensation, each calculation, each emotional nuance. Margaret spoke, her voice smooth, precise, carrying the faintest edge of expectation. "Ethan, I trust you understand the importance of neighborhood cohesion," and the cadence, the slight pause before her words finished, carried both authority and invitation, testing my response, probing for hesitation or concession, and I allowed a micro-smile to cross my face, acknowledging the challenge while keeping my own demeanor measured, human, imperfect, layered with curiosity, doubt, and careful anticipation. I stepped closer to the edge of the driveway, the gravel shifting beneath my boots, feeling the uneven surface press against my soles, the slight warmth of the sun on my neck, the faint taste of coffee lingering from a mug earlier, all sensations weaving into the fabric of attention, awareness, and readiness, and I realized that every ordinary detail, every smell, sound, movement, and shadow was now part of the tactical landscape, the cinematic tableau that framed the subtle psychological confrontation. I considered my next words, weighing tone, timing, and cadence, recognizing that the smallest inflection could shift perception, influence authority, or reveal intention, while the natural human imperfection of hesitation, fatigue, and emotional vulnerability lent authenticity and depth to each potential response, ensuring that the interaction remained dynamic, layered, and compelling. The distant chirp of birds, the rustle of the wind through the tall grass, the occasional hum of a passing vehicle served as constant reminders of life outside this focused confrontation, yet they also created a rhythm, a pacing that allowed each pause, each reveal, each subtle shift of power to resonate more fully, drawing attention to micro-reactions, fleeting expressions, and the intricate mental calculations underlying every glance and gesture. Margaret's gaze met mine again, unwavering, precise, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the almost imperceptible hesitation behind her composed mask, a crack in the seemingly flawless armor of authority, and it spurred a surge of resolve, curiosity, and anticipation in me, reinforcing the delicate balance of observation, patience, and subtle strategic maneuvering. As the late afternoon sun continued to stretch shadows long across my land, turning every small gesture, every micro-expression, every tactile sensation into a critical piece of the unfolding, cinematic, human narrative. The late afternoon sun had softened, bathing the hills in a golden hue that made the tall grasses sway with a quiet elegance, and I felt a subtle tension ease in my chest, even as anticipation hummed beneath the surface, the kind that makes every micro-movement and gesture feel magnified in significance. Margaret shifted again, her heels clicking faintly on the gravel, fuchsia blazer glinting with each movement, her posture immaculate yet with slight imperfections, the barely noticeable crease in her blouse or the micro-adjustment of her stance revealing that even the most calculated authority carries human traces, and I caught myself studying these nuances, cataloging every twitch, every glance, every subtle exhale as part of a larger mental map, a strategic observation woven into the cinematic tableau of my land. I ran a hand over the clipboard, feeling the textured edges press into my palm, grounding me in the tangible, the physical reality of deeds, surveys, and historical documents, a repository of patience, persistence, and personal investment that now served as a quiet, immovable leverage point against her polished confidence. The wind rustled through the grasses along the fence line, carrying with it the faint scent of earth warmed by the sun and the distant aroma of toasted bread from a neighbor's breakfast. Ordinary suburban sounds that contrasted sharply with the charged interaction unfolding in the center of my property, emphasizing the intricate dance between human imperfection and deliberate strategy. Margaret's voice broke the ambient hum, measured, precise, and faintly challenging. "Ethan, I am confident you will see the wisdom in cooperating." And the cadence of her words, the deliberate pause before the final syllable, forced me to weigh tone, timing, and content in a mental balancing act, testing my ability to respond authentically while maintaining strategic awareness. I shifted my weight, gravel crunching under my boots, feeling the fatigue in my shoulders from the day's labor and the subtle ache in my knees from standing too long, and allowed myself a brief internal exhale, acknowledging the human element of imperfection, hesitation, an uncertainty that imbued each decision with authenticity and suspense. The birds continued their intermittent chirping. The distant engine hum of a passing vehicle punctuated the stillness. The ordinary sensory landscape juxtaposed against the layered tension of observation, microanalysis, and anticipation, each contributing to a dynamic pacing that alternated between pause and escalation, curiosity and revelation. I let my gaze sweep over the property, the oak tree casting a long shadow, the fence posts uneven yet stable, the subtle undulations of the gravel path, and allowed a mental rehearsal of scenarios, evaluating the social, psychological, and procedural implications of each potential response, the natural doubt and hesitation feeding into a curiosity loop that made every minor movement significant, every glance loaded with potential insight. Margaret adjusted the tilt of her head, the faint narrowing of her eyes a signal I had learned to read over hours of observation, and I felt a flicker of anticipation mixed with quiet amusement at the contrast between the polished exterior of authority and the delicate human traces of doubt or calculation beneath, a cinematic layering that made the unfolding scene rich, textured, and emotionally compelling. I felt the warmth of the sun on my neck, the subtle pressure of the clipboard against my torso, and the gentle tug of anticipation in my chest, each sensation reinforcing awareness, observation, and preparation. And as the wind shifted again, moving through the grasses and brushing lightly against my jeans, I recognized that the next few moments, each micro-decision, each carefully chosen word or gesture, could shift the delicate balance of power, turn hesitation into opportunity, and propel the narrative toward the pivotal resolution that had been building quietly since the morning, leaving both of us poised in a cinematic, emotionally charged, and humanly imperfect standoff that demanded attention, patience, and subtle strategy. The sun had dipped lower, bathing the hills in a rich amber glow, the long shadows stretching across the gravel driveway. As I felt a mingling of relief and lingering tension in my chest, every muscle still alert from hours of observation, anticipation, and subtle negotiation. Margaret stood near the property line, her heels clicking softly against the ground, fuchsia blazer glowing in the fading light, hair perfectly styled yet with small, human imperfections, a stray curl, a slight shift in posture, that reminded me she was not invincible, just as fallible as anyone. I shifted my weight, the uneven gravel pressing into the soles of my boots, the faint scent of earth and crushed grass blending with the distant aroma of a neighbor's kitchen, grounding the scene in reality even as every glance, every micro-expression, and every subtle inflection between us carried the weight of the entire morning's tension. I adjusted the clipboard in my hands, feeling the textured edges press into my palms, a tangible connection to the surveys, deeds, and notes I had meticulously collected, each one a silent testament to patience, preparation, and personal investment, and a reminder that tangible evidence combined with careful observation could tip the balance at any moment. The wind stirred through the tall grass, rustling softly, carrying with it the faint hum of a distant car engine and the chirp of birds settling in for evening, creating an auditory frame for the final act of this quiet battle of wits, patience, and strategy. Margaret's gaze met mine, unwavering, precise, and I caught a fleeting twitch in the corner of her mouth, the slightest narrowing of her eyes, subtle indicators of calculation, curiosity, and perhaps a trace of doubt, and I felt the thrill of anticipation mixed with human hesitation, the emotional cliffhanger that had threaded through every interaction all morning, now building toward resolution. I let a slow exhale, grounding myself in the warmth of the fading sunlight, feeling the fatigue in my shoulders and the subtle ache in my knees, and allowed my mind to catalog every gesture, every word, every pause, turning them into a strategic pattern of observation and potential leverage, all while keeping my own reactions authentic, imperfect, and grounded in the lived experience of a homeowner protecting a space he loved. The ordinary sounds of suburban life, the distant hum of lawnmowers, intermittent dog barks, the faint murmur of conversation from other yards, contrasted with the intensity between us, emphasizing the cinematic quality of the scene, the layering of human emotion, curiosity, and imperfect strategy against the backdrop of a mundane world unaware of the psychological stakes unfolding. I considered carefully the timing of my next words, the cadence, the inflection, balancing assertiveness with composure, and recognized that even a small shift, a measured smile, a subtle gesture, a brief pause, could create a power reversal, an opportunity, a revelation that Margaret did not anticipate. She adjusted her stance, the gentle click of her heels punctuating the moment, and I sensed her calculation, her awareness of the stakes, her precise management of authority, and I felt a surge of anticipation, curiosity, and strategic focus, knowing that patience, observation, and subtle human cues would determine the outcome. The amber light softened further, brushing across my land, illuminating every nuance of grass, gravel, and fence post, and I felt a quiet thrill in realizing that each careful move, each measured gesture, each thoughtful consideration of emotional and social dynamics had positioned me to reclaim not just a piece of property, but a sense of control and affirmation. And as Margaret's eyes flicked briefly toward the horizon before returning to mine, I understood that the delicate balance of strategy, patience, human imperfection, and cinematic tension had reached its culmination, the long morning of anticipation and careful observation now poised to resolve in a manner that was both just, subtle, and deeply satisfying, leaving the quiet hills around us as witness to the intricate, human, and authentic unfolding of events that had defined the day.